In a cloud of gun smoke and hoof dust, a sizable herd of your best cattle disappear into the desert alongside the daring bandits who took them. The harrowing echoes of the rustlers' celebratory cries ring out across the rugged wasteland, their slim forms fading into the silver moonlight. They came on like ghosts, silent as the dead as they carried out their criminal intent. There is no shame, however, in befalling this ambush. These were Apache men, warriors born and bred beneath the relentless heat of the desert sun. Strange, though, was the face of their leader, whom you saw in the flash of muzzle fire. You are sure you've seen this man before. Not in person, mind you, but on the wanted posters of your childhood. The year is 1932, and the man you just saw has been dead going on 30 years. That aged, weather-worn face will surely haunt your dreams till you too are dead and buried. In the waning days of the 19th century, a shadow of terror swept across the desolate borderlands where Mexico, Arizona, and New Mexico meet. A wild, violent man stalked the cactus-dappled hills, killing and marauding indiscriminately. While the man was in fact of indigenous descent, his victims were not relegated to the Anglo settlers and Mexican peasants that eked out a hardscrabble existence from the desert sand. Even the many native tribes of the region cowered frightfully in the wake of so much violence. On April 29, 1894, the San Francisco Examiner gave this villain the epithet Apache Ishmael, reporting the bandit in question had, quote, written his name in letters of blood throughout the land. However, the West had already come to know this man by another name, the Apache Kid. For years, victims reported witnessing this Apache Kid carrying out heinous crimes, including, but not limited to, murder, thievery, and rape. The notorious outlaw and his renegade band of Apaches were eventually captured and levied a substantial sentence in the Yuma Territorial Prison. On November 2, 1889, while in transit to Yuma from Globe, Arizona, a violent escape was staged. The ensuing struggle cost 2 men, including Sheriff Glenn Reynolds, their lives. In the aftermath, a great manhunt swept across the region. With the cooperation of bounty hunters, the United States Army, and local militias, 9 runaway bandits were captured and brought to justice. The Apache Kid, however, was not among them. In 1890, a contingent of Mexican soldiers were drawn into an engagement with a band of Apache renegades in the mountains just south of the border. When the gunsmoke finally cleared and the battlefield surveyed, one of the soldiers came across the body of a fallen Apache warrior. In the dead man's possession was a pistol and a pocket watch, both once belonging to the late Sheriff Glenn Reynolds, the same man who had been killed during the Apache Kid's desperate escape just 1 year prior. In a later report, it was stated that the Apache on which the items had been found simply appeared too old to have been the real Apache Kid, despite the admittedly meager evidence to the contrary. Regardless, the quibbling details did not stop this incident from spreading into the first announcement of the Apache Kid's supposed death. Even with an obituary penned and printed, reports of the Apache Kid participating in criminal activity persisted throughout 1894. Popular opinion was that the outlaw had escaped death, at least for a time. In September of that same year, cattleman Charles Anderson and a posse of cowboys from New Mexico ambushed a gang of cattle rustlers in the San Mateo Mountains southwest of Socorro, New Mexico. Though the shootout was not as successful as Anderson may have hoped, they did manage to slay one of the rustlers. While investigating the single corpse, they were no doubt surprised to find that the notorious Apache Kid lay dead at their feet. The body was buried unceremoniously at the foot of Blue Mountain. As a makeshift tombstone, the cowboys hacked apart the trunk of a nearby tree. The tree, still bearing the scars of axe and blade, yet stands at Cyclone's saddle in the shadow of a peak carrying the outlaw's very name. Even with this new proclamation, tales of the Apache Kid continued, his legend growing with every uttered word. It seemed that even with 2 deaths under his belt, the renegade simply could not be stopped. Famous lawman John Horton Slaughter, also known as Texas John Slaughter, earned his tough-as-nails reputation on the blood-soaked battlefields of the southern United States. After serving the Confederate Army during the American Civil War, Slaughter drove cattle from Texas to Kansas over the Chisholm Trail. His cattle business eventually led him through the territory of New Mexico and into Arizona, where, in 1884, he purchased the San Bernardino Ranch near Douglas. 2 years later, he would be elected sheriff of Tombstone, a short 5 years after the legendary gunfight at the OK Corral. While serving 2 back-to-back terms, he aided the military in tracking infamous Apache Chief Geronimo and even arrested the Jack Taylor Gang. Throughout his life, Slaughter was married twice, his first wife dying of smallpox in 1877. Only 2 of their 4 children survived into adulthood. 2 years later, in 1879, he married Cora Viola Howell in Tularosa, New Mexico. While the pair had no biological children, they adopted several, including the reported daughter of the Apache Kid, whom John had personally sent to the grave. While pursuing Apache rebels alongside government-hired Apache scouts, Slaughter claimed to have encountered the Apache Kid at a campsite in Mexico on June 21, 1896. The story of this ill-fated meeting has numerous tellings. In one, Slaughter and his Apache scouts scattered the men and women who left behind a single, swaddled baby girl. In another, John managed to kill the Apache Kid. Regardless of what truly happened, John returned to his ranch with a small Apache child. History remembers this child as Apache May Slaughter. Upon her adoption, she coincidentally became the great-great-great-granddaughter of another legend of the American frontier, Daniel Boone. The young girl lived a very brief life as something of a celebrity, touted around as heir of the Apache Kid. She met her unfortunate and untimely death at the age of 5 when her dress caught fire as she played near a pot of boiling water. In 1899, 4 years after Slaughter's incident in Mexico, the Apache Kid was again sighted alive and well in the Sierra Madres. Colonel Emilio Kosterlitsky, a Russian-born Mexican and leader of the Rurales, Mexico's mounted rural police force, reported seeing the outlaw amongst a band of Apaches living high in an isolated mountain valley. It seems, despite repeated moments of finality, the Apache Kid simply refused to die. Word of the bandit continued to proliferate throughout the West, and dozens of crimes were heaped upon his name. In some of these stories, the Apache Kid met death once again, some saying at the barrel of a gun, others detailing a slow, painful death at the hands of tuberculosis. In November of 1900, a contingent of Mormon settlers that included numerous church leaders claimed to have once again slain the Apache Kid, identifying him by the field glasses that hung about his neck. Supposedly, there were few Apache renegades who had access to this technology, and the binoculars were clearly a keepsake from the kid's time serving as an Apache scout in the United States Army. While diaries and journal entries from church elder Orson Pratt Brown described photographs of the body having been taken, none have ever surfaced. Anthony Ivins, an apostle to Mormon President Joseph F. Smith, was reported to have seen a wanted poster for the Apache Kid on the San Carlos Reservation. They say he harbored much desire for the reward and had a hand in initiating the hunt. Despite this, no bounty for the Apache Kid was ever claimed. However, A.O. Woodruff, yet another member of the Mormon hunting party, did pen a description of the event in excruciating detail. The Mormons buried the bodies beneath 3 feet of stone, but were commanded by Mexican officials to dig them up again. Not to identify the kid, mind you, but to make sure the Mormon gringos had in fact killed Apaches and not any Mexican citizens. Examining the excavated remains, the officials were satisfied that the bodies belonged to Indios Barbaros, savage Indians. However, there is no statement from the Mexican government on whether or not the Apache Kid was among the dead. The Mormons, though, were sure. They framed the slaying as a sort of revenge mission, citing an Apache raid supposedly led by the Kid in 1886 that resulted in the murder of multiple Mormon ranchers. There are no less than 18 separate reports of the Apache Kid's demise, yet his raiding continued well into the 1930s. Famed Norwegian explorer Helge Ingstad entered Sonora, Mexico in the winter of 1937, searching for what he believed was a lost tribe of Apaches. The adventurer and anthropologist had spent 4 years amongst the Chipewyan tribe in the Northwest Territories of Canada, a journey chronicled in his book The Land of Feast and Famine. While there, the Chipewyans told him of a splinter tribe that had traveled south and never returned. While questing for the location of this Apache paradise, Ingstad traveled through a Mormon village near Colonia Juarez, coincidentally a place of refuge similar to the one he sought. In 1890, a population of Mormons fled the United States for northern Mexico when the Church of Latter-day Saints officially abandoned the practice of polygamy. There, they founded numerous settlements throughout the state of Chihuahua, opting to continue their traditional way of life free from interference and judgment. Upon inquiring about Apaches in the area, the Mormons confirmed their presence and doubled down on the belief that their forebears had killed a notable renegade, the Apache Kid, in 1899. Ingstad had heard of this man while visiting the Apaches of the White Mountains, but they had left out a key detail in the Mormon story. According to them, another daughter of the Apache Kid still survived. In the rocky foothills of the Sierra Madres lived a woman named Guadalupe Fimbres Munoz, Lupe for short. She bore a striking resemblance to the Apache Kid. On top of the physical characteristics, she had extensive childhood memories that seemed to back up a familial connection. Ingstad was enamored with this woman, describing her as tough and aggressive, with fine features, pitch-black hair, and an evident intelligence. At Ingstad's behest, she explained to him that she had been abducted by vaqueros in 1910, then raised by a childless Mexican couple living in Nacari Chico. When she was 14, Lupe ran back to the mountains, hoping to reconnect with the people she had been taken from, but, unfortunately, they were nowhere to be found. On her journey, she did learn of her biological father's death. Disheartened, she returned to her adoptive parents, eventually marrying a Mexican man and starting a family of her own. Lupe was 40 years of age when Ingstad introduced himself to her, but still harbored uncanny memories of her father. She claimed that he was a scout for the United States Army, that he had been arrested but also escaped imprisonment, killing 2 men in the process. She claimed that he fled into the mountains of Mexico and that he was an accomplished warrior. Despite the many instances of the Apache Kid evidently surviving death, something typically relegated to myth and fantasy, the outlaw was in fact a real and documented person. According to the information provided by both Lupe and the United States Army, the Kid was born around the year 1860, likely to the Black Rock band of Apache living in Aravaipa Canyon in southeastern Arizona. His birth name was Haske Bene Natale, and he would spend an unfortunately short period of time living free with his own kind. As a young boy, the Kid was captured by Yuma warriors and held captive for a number of years. Eventually, he was rescued by the United States Army and set free. With no family and cast out into an uncaring world that had no use for an Apache orphan, he was left to wander the dusty streets alone. It was during this time that the moniker Apache Kid was earned. It seems that the mostly Anglo populace of the area he frequented had an exceedingly difficult time pronouncing his name. To circumvent this obstacle, they simply referred to him by the title Kid, or Apache Kid. In the mid-1870s, the Kid met Al Sieber, chief of the Army Scouts, who quickly took the promising young man under his wing. While unintentioned, it was Sieber who set him on the path to become one of the borderland's most notorious outlaws. In 1881, Apache Kid signed on with the United States Cavalry as an Indian Scout, a program spearheaded by General George Crook. The so-called Indian Wars were in full swing, and the Army was finding it increasingly difficult to combat renegade Apaches led by the likes of Cochise, Geronimo, and Victorio, all notable experts in guerrilla warfare. The Kid rode alongside Sieber, as well as General Crook and General Nelson A. Miles, in a campaign to hunt down renegade Apaches throughout the Sierra Madres of Mexico. In 1882, due to his fighting prowess and astute tracking abilities, the Kid was promoted to the rank of sergeant. In 1885, he was involved in a drunken riot perpetrated by his fellow Apache scouts, but his makeshift father figure rescued him from death by hanging and sent him back north. During this time as a scout, the Kid married into a prominent Apache family, making him the son-in-law to Chief Hashkabansizin, providing him high-profile status within the Apache community. The Kid, with the guidance of Al Sieber, had created for him a comfortable life of sorts, at least in comparison to his experience as a homeless street urchin. However, due to unforeseeable circumstances, his path would take a hard left turn and sent him down a road of violence and notoriety. In May of 1887, Sieber and a group of officers were called away from the San Carlos Reservation. In their absence, the Apache Kid was left in charge. With the upper echelon of command away on business, the Apache scouts decided to throw a party, brewing up a large batch of saguaro wine, a tonic the Tohono O'odham called Tiswin. Some versions of this legend say the party was actually a sacred Apache ceremony, gathered in the wake of an ominous earthquake only a few days earlier. Regardless of the occasion, while in the midst of a drunken revelry, 2 scouts fell into a brawl that resulted in the death of another prominent Apache, Togo de Chuz. The relationship between the Apache Kid and this man is muddied by history. Some sources claim he was his biological father, or perhaps grandfather. However, Togo de Chuz was a member of the White Mountain Band, so any blood relation with the Kid seems unlikely. The bond, whatever it was, had been strong enough for the Apache Kid to swiftly enact revenge upon the murderer Gonzizi, as well as the man's brother. When Sieber returned, he was furious. He and Lieutenant John Pierce ordered the immediate surrender of everyone involved. They would be placed under arrest until the issue could be properly resolved. Here, the story diverges yet again. One telling claims an onlooker in the gathered crowd fired a shot. Another says that when the Kid surrendered his arms, his revolver accidentally went off. Yet another says that a jealous rival intentionally fired his gun. In the aftermath, Sieber was permanently wounded, a bullet having shattered his ankle. In the burst of sudden confusion, the Apache Kid was left with no choice but to flee the only stable life he had ever known. The U.S. Army quickly mobilized the 4th Cavalry to chase down the fleeing Apaches, but were mostly unsuccessful. The fugitives were given frequent aid by the very Apaches they had once hunted, who sympathized with their plight. Eventually, the Kid contacted the Army and offered submission if only the cavalry was recalled. The Army complied on June 25, 1887. The Apache Kid turned himself in. The citizens harbored no love for the Apache scouts and subsequently sentenced the Kid and 4 others to death by firing squad, naming them guilty of both mutiny and desertion. However, the Kid had ingratiated himself to not only Sieber, who did not want to see his friend killed, but also General Miles, who intervened on his behalf. The sentencing was reduced from execution to life in prison, though it was once again reduced to 10 years. The Apache Kid and his companions were sent to Alcatraz, where they were imprisoned until October of 1889, when the sentence was completely overturned due to obvious prejudice. Once again free, the Kid returned to Globe only to be met with animosity and disdain. Here, history is once again convoluted by parallel paths within the narrative. The white settlers of the area were unhappy with the Scouts' expunged record, and in some cases, Al Sieber himself is said to have led the witch hunt. Those who tell it this way claim that Sieber felt betrayed by his underling and wanted to see him punished for the grievous wound. In retribution, the mob brought up civil charges, accusing the Kid of attempted murder. In a handful of accounts, Sieber is said to have defended his adopted son, while just as many tales recount the opposite as true. Even then, there was no physical evidence that the Apache Kid was at fault for the injury. It is recorded that a number of witnesses came to the Kid's defense, but his destiny had already been decided. The Apache Kid was convicted and sentenced again to a 7-year stint at Yuma anyway. Once again placed in shackles and caged, it was en route to Yuma when the Apache Kid's final escape would take place. While transporting 9 Apache prisoners to Yuma Territorial Prison, the wagon came to a steep rocky pass known as Kelvin Grade. In order to safely navigate the obstacle, 7 of the prisoners were removed from their cell and ordered to make the trek on foot. The Apache Kid, however, alongside one other prisoner, was considered too dangerous to let loose. Sheriff Reynolds, the owner of the aforementioned pistol and pocket watch, led the 7 prisoners on foot, with Sheriff William A. Hunky Dory Holmes taking up the rear. Stagecoach owner Eugene Middleton was relegated to driving the wagon and its remaining passengers down the precarious path. Throughout the difficult trek, 2 of the lead prisoners inched their way closer to Reynolds, while the back 2 slowed to lessen the gap between them and Holmes. In an instant, they pounced upon their jailers, seizing a shotgun and a rifle. Reynolds was shot and died instantly. Holmes, attempting a frantic escape, dropped suddenly due to a heart attack and was left for dead. Middleton was evidently ordered to enter the open cell but hid in a bush instead. Tired of negotiating, an Apache fired into the scrub. The bullet passed through Middleton's mouth, missing every single one of his teeth, and exited out the back of his neck. In shock but still conscious, Middleton watched in horror as one of the prisoners hefted a rock from the broken earth and prepared to cave his skull. To his amazement, the Apache Kid stayed the would-be killer's hand, saving Middleton's life. Later, he would claim that he had shared a cigarette with the Kid, the kindness having spurred the prisoner to action. The so-called Kelvin Grade Massacre would be the last time the West would unquestionably know the location of the much-maligned Apache Kid. From there, the Apache Kid disappears into a realm of hearsay and legend, trapped in an ongoing cycle of supposed violence and suspected death. Knowing the historical details of the Apache Kid's life before Lamb paints his actions in a much different light. While it is reasonable to assume that he had participated in more than one raid after fleeing Mexico, including some that resulted in innocent deaths, there remains many questions about the countless other crimes for which he was blamed. As far as the historical record goes, he seemed to have been most guilty in the slaying of the 2 Apache scouts involved in the murder of his supposed relative. Despite his guilt, it seems a number of his superiors sympathized with the action and did everything they could to see the Kid set free. The slayings, after all, were a matter of honor, of vengeance and swift justice. How many stories of similar retribution are celebrated when doled out at the hands of a gunslinger or a notable lawman? How different are these actions from, say, those of Wyatt Earp when he gunned down the Clanton boys at the OK Corral? Was not Earp's motivation rooted in retaliation for his murdered brother Morgan? It is true that Wyatt was an agent of the law at the time, but so too was the Apache Kid, at least technically. We know the Kid was left in charge of a contingent of men in the absence of superior officers. Was that directive enough to allow for judgment and execution of criminals caught in the act? And let us not forget that Wyatt Earp himself engaged in dealings both shady and outright illegal. It is also worth noting that the Apache Kid was a man torn between two worlds. That he was Apache by blood he was surely aware, despite having spent little time within the confines of that world. Through wit and willpower, he made himself useful to another world, one that wanted little to do with his kind. He served in the United States military, helping to hunt down the very people to which he truly belonged. When push came to shove, he sided with the government and turned against his own scouts. The Kid even offered peaceful surrender, following through on his word only to receive a punishment that some would say outweighed his crimes. When finally acquitted and set free, a hung jury brought about trumped-up charges, going so far as to outright ignore the testimony of key witnesses. Even at the bitter end, he saved the life of one of his jailers. So why was it that the world the Apache Kid worked so hard to become part of wanted him gone so badly? Was it that he was Apache? Or did the people of Globe truly see a streak of villainy that had somehow escaped Sieber and later General Miles? Given a different set of circumstances, could the Apache Kid have found a place within American society? Or was he always destined to be a man strung precariously between two disparate existences, never truly belonging in either? Sitting here, over a century removed from the events surrounding the Kid's life and supposed deaths, I cannot truly say whether this man was a villain as portrayed, or a man wronged by a society that rejected him. Perhaps, in the end, the Apache Kid serves as another testament to the complicated nature of a particularly turbulent time in American history. So, where and when did the Apache Kid really die? Unfortunately, there is no real concrete answer to that question. It is quite possible that any one of the accounts were actually true. Due to the variations in the tale of John Horton's slaughter, the occasion does not seem a likely candidate. For that matter, neither does the earliest account involving the pocket watch of Sheriff Reynolds. There is no real reason to doubt the report that the body holding the artifacts was of a man too old to be the Kid. It seems more likely the soldiers had simply been caught up in the excitement. There is also no reason to assume the Apache Kid would have kept the items as keepsakes, especially given the fact he didn't even kill Reynolds himself. If the objects ever were in the Kid's possession, there are countless reasons for him to have traded them away. The most convincing account to me is that of the Mormons, given the ample detail expressed in various journals. That said, the story is not above suspicion. The fact that the reward emblazoned on wanted posters was never collected is telling. It also begs the question, why did the Mexican officials so intent on identifying the bodies not corroborate the tale? The least likely report, by this narrator's reckoning, is the Rustler raid carried out by Charles Anderson. Early on in the research, it seemed plausible, especially given the wilderness area the gravesite now inhabits is named for the Apache Kid. However, a later report was discovered that read almost exactly the same, with one major difference. It was not the Apache Kid that had been killed, but another famous renegade named Masai. That the year given matched that of Masai's supposed death did not help the matter. That Apaches were killed in most, if not all, of these skirmishes is realistic. The true names of the dead, however, are lost to time. It is difficult to say exactly how the Apache Kid spent his last days. In a strange, prophetic coincidence, the Apache Kid's true name roughly translates to the tall man destined to come to a mysterious end. Perhaps it was fate, written in so many stars, that the Kid would simply fade away. As for Lupe, the suspected daughter of the Apache Kid, she too lived a difficult life not wholly unlike that of her supposed father. Today, there are many who take on faith the familial bond of Apache blood held between the two figures. However, Without access to the miracles of modern genetics and DNA analysis, the truth will likely forever remain a mystery. Thank you for listening to this episode of Mysterious West. If you are interested in further reading, check the show notes in the episode description. There you will find links to all the books, resources, and articles I used in my research. Please subscribe and leave a review if you are so inclined. History is messy, and records are often incomplete. If I missed something or reported anything wrong, I'd love to hear about it. Throughout this episode, I attempt to pronounce the names of numerous Apache men, a Norwegian explorer, and a Canadian indigenous tribe. That I did so incorrectly is a likely scenario. If that be the case, know that my intent was earnest, and I apologize for my failures. This is your host, JD Wicks, reminding you to sit tall in the saddle and keep your eye on the skyline. I'll see you at the next campfire.